If you ever get lost when going to the grocery store or something, you can always ask someone for directions, or I guess take the antisocial route, whip out your phone and Google Maps. But should you, for some reason, find yourself on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean in the age of pirates, there would have been no such luxuries. They didn't have anything like GPS or radar. Instead, mariners were utterly dependent on skillful navigation. Sailing was an art, and every pirate was not an artist. Far from it. Common are the incidents of them getting caught in a storm, shipwrecked, marooned, run aground, or ending up in a place completely unintended. And, just like me in Port Royal every Saturday night, often as a result of severe drinking. Now, some pirates only ever operated in a small area. Their bases were usually situated close to a geographic choke point, where potential captures would predictably travel. A perfect example is the island of Tortuga. Spanish ships would travel along the coastline just opposite to it, or via the windward passage. All you had to do was go out in a canoe, capture the ship, and use the coastline or geographic landmarks to lead you back home. Easy as rum. Indeed, although the ocean is open and virtually endless, pretty much all vessels in the Age of Sail traveled along predictable paths known as sea lanes. Basically, a sea lane was the most convenient way of traveling between point A and B. This was affected by geographical and hydrographical features, such as winds, currents, and tides, but also man-made factors like politics. Who controlled a certain port, if nations were at war, if a place was plagued by pirates, etc. In the Mediterranean basin, sea lanes were more dictated by political and economic influence than actual physical conditions. Ships traveled along coastlines for ease of navigation, and were dependent on veteran sailors who had frequently visited the area. In some places, it was even illegal to tear down architectural landmarks like church steeples, which mariners relied upon to get their bearings. Even if these lanes were well established, you could still get lost. You might end up someplace entirely new, or you might intend to go to uncharted waters in the first place and explore, or head on very long and difficult journeys, like the pirates going from the Caribbean to Madagascar. All of these required a high level of navigation, knowledge, skill, and a talented navigator. Today, we shall learn all about it. Period navigation was a confusing mess of science, astrology, and pure guesswork, both among pirates and their legal equivalents. We shall now cover the specifics of navigation in the Age of Sail. Navigation began with the navigator deciding his start point and end point, where he was going. He then set his course, that is, direction. Most important was to determine the current position, both at the start of the journey and at the end of each day, in order to know how much farther you had to go. There are two different types of positions, absolute or relative. Your absolute position is determined by using longitude and latitude. With this system, the world is divided into a massive grid. The lines going north or south are the latitudinal lines, and your position on this line is your latitude. The lines going east or west are the longitudinal lines, and your position on it is your longitude. Take your longitude and latitude, and you have your absolute position. Seems easy enough, right? Today, these two are inseparable, but in the Age of Sail, they had no reliable method of calculating the longitude. Whilst the latitude could easily be determined by observing the angle of the Sun or North Star, the problem with determining longitude comes from the fact that the Earth is constantly rotating. Determining longitude requires an accurate time reference in order to compare local time to where you started from. As early as 1530, an astronomer named Gemma Frisius constructed a pendulum clock that accurately determined the longitude. But these clocks only ever functioned on land. When brought to sea, they were messed up by the changing humidity, temperature, and constant rolling. Further attempts were made, none of them with any success. Scientists spent their lives trying to solve the problem with ingenious inventions or the use of astronomy, without any success. The frustration in this period of unsuccessfully trying to find a longitude is reflected in this drawing by Hogarth, depicting a patient of the Bedlam Insane Asylum, seemingly trying to resolve the problem. Godspeed, my friend. Can we get him some support in the comments? Instead, sailors commonly relied on a method called plain sailing. It considered the Earth as a flat surface, struck by imaginary lines of longitude and latitude, like a checkerboard. Of course, they did know that the Earth wasn't flat. It was just more convenient for navigating. Anyway, knowing the course and distance, the difference in latitude can be found. The longitude was unknown and usually guessed. There were Mercator charts depicting longitudinal lines called meridians that converged towards the poles, but these were somewhat uncommon. Therefore, plain sailing was only really efficient over short distances. For that reason, a long trip was usually divided into several smaller trips, with frequent stops. The relative position is easier to determine. It is your position compared to some fixed or known point. One of the most common methods up until the 19th century was celestial. Mariners could determine their relative position by either using the position of the North Star or the four major directions of the magnetic compass compared with north. The most relied upon were fixed landmarks. These were geographical features like mountains, cliffs, headlands, and man-made structures such as lighthouses and church steeples. One of the most relied upon landmarks were the islands of the Atlantic. Sailing east from the Canary Islands, you would ultimately reach Africa. Sail west, and you arrived in the Bahamas. North from the Azores, Iceland. And due south to the coast of Africa, you'd follow it to reach the Cape of Good Hope. From the Cape, strike to the northeast, and eventually you'd reach Madagascar. Proceed between Madagascar and Mozambique, and you reach Arabia or India. This method of calculating your current position based on a previous fixed position is called dead reckoning. The ship's current position had to be determined at the end of each day. This estimation was always messed up by wind direction, tides, currents, and the erratic sailing qualities of the vessel. Therefore, they constantly had to measure the speed of the ship, or at least approximate it. This was done with a tool called the line and log. Historically, it seems to have been a literal log, but by the 15th century, it had developed into a triangular board. This log was attached to a line connected to a reel. The line had knots tied into it at definite intervals. To measure the ship's speed, the log was thrown overboard from the bow of the ship. As the ship sped forward, the resistance of the water pulled the log towards the stern of the ship. Meanwhile, a 30-second sand glass was flipped. When all of the sand had fallen, the sailor counted how many of those little knots tied into the line had been pulled from the reel within the 30-second time span. The number of knots was an estimate of the ship's speed, translating over into nautical miles per hour. A vessel that pulled 6 knots from the reel was doing 6 nautical miles per hour. That is why we're still using knots as a unit of ship speed, even though we're not throwing logs overboard. The log was thrown out every half hour, also measured with a sand glass. The speed was then recorded on a traverse board. This board had holes corresponding to different speeds, and you placed the peg in a hole that matched the current speed, each representing one of the 8 half hours or 4 hours that made up a watch, a sailor's work shift. It also had holes formed into concentric circles for documenting the course according to the compass. You could also estimate how much the wind was pushing the ship off course by looking at the angle of the log line. This angle was called leeway, or motion of the ship away from the wind. Leeway could cause a lot of errors in measuring the ship's forward speed, and every ship had a unique leeway that the navigator had to consider. A ship with next to no leeway was called weatherly. At the end of every watch, the navigator would look to the board to make his calculations of the distance and course traveled. Using a chart and a set of dividers, he would plot the vessel's displacement from where it had sailed to where it now resided. He basically moved the dividers like a pair of legs forward. We can often see pirate captains and such doing this in movies and illustrations. Then, he would calculate a new azimuth, or new magnetic compass course, for the next watch. Here's hoping the compass was true, and that the speed had been measured correctly. Every noon, the navigator would try to fix his position by taking sightings of the sun. At midnight he would do the same, if the weather was clear, this time using the polar star. At the end of each day, he would record anything relevant to the ship's navigation: wind, speed, course, position, besides events and anomalies, in the so-called logbook, named after the log. These logbooks often contained illustrations of geographical landmarks and headlands, and have become essential for our understanding of maritime history. Logbooks are nowadays ubiquitous to modern society and used much outside of navigation, indicating how much our civilization has been shaped by the efforts of early modern mariners. These methods, the line and log, 30-second glass, and traverse boards, were the main navigational tools used from the late Middle Ages to the early 20th century. That is how pirates navigated their ships. But of course, theory is nothing without a man putting them into practice. Pirate ships needed a skilled navigator. In charge of navigation was the master, also known as sailing master. He was the single most important man aboard a ship, even more so than the captain. Indeed, even though captain was often used informally, by strict definition, it required one to have a naval commission. Captain was traditionally just a naval military grade. Therefore, most merchant vessels did not have a captain, only a master, who was often a partial or the sole owner of the ship, especially if it was small. He would then carry out the captain's duties of command, in addition to managing sailing and navigation. If the ship did have a captain, he would sail and navigate the ship under the captain's direction. Owing to his importance, the master could expect a lot of privileges on a merchant or navy ship. He was typically given his own cabin, located on the very top of the aftercastle, and known as the roundhouse or coach. In here he would house all of his books, maps, and the navigational tools. It was here that he would chart the course of the voyage together with the captain, and also where he might sleep and eat. Besides navigation, he would also serve as a prominent officer. According to a set of instructions provided by a period book called the Seaman's Vademecum, the master was expected to manage provisions, ballast and cargo space, in addition to his regular duties of navigating, keeping a logbook, and documenting newly discovered coasts and shoals. To assist him in these matters, the master had one or multiple assistants called mates. There was the first mate, second mate, third mate, and so on and so on. The optimal navigator was highly educated, especially in mathematics. Precise navigation required knowledge of position, speed, direction, and time, and accomplished navigators had to apply algebra, geometry, trigonometry, geography, astronomy, meteorology, vector analysis, and physics, using rudimentary maps and instruments. Age of Sail navigators made great strides in modern mathematics, but in a period where the traditional religious worldview was being scrutinized by the creep of the scientific method, magic was deemed as tenable as algebra. Scientists like Newton believed in astrology and that astral bodies were living beings. Mathematics were often seen as one type of magic, and navigators might rely on stranger methods like astrology to assist them in navigation, consulting horoscopes and such. Although there was an optimal navigator, reality made them exceedingly uncommon, and it was difficult to find a good navigator capable of moving confidently across the open ocean. When Samuel Pepys sought to reform the Navy in the 1670s, one of his instigations was to establish a mathematical school for the education of young navigators. By 1677, the school had spiraled out of control. The schoolmaster was a loose-living drunk, and the boys spent most of their time playing football or dozing. Their skills in numeracy and literacy were below standard. After a few decades, he just gave up. Nonetheless, throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, navigational schools sprung up across the Old and New World coastlines. From the school bench and out of the classroom, young navigators would emerge on the dockyard with a bright smile and striped sack loaded on their shoulder, ready to take on the open ocean. They would begin their practical training aboard a ship, overseen by the sailing master's watchful eye. Should they seem promising, they might ascend to the position of his mate, and then, eventually, become a navigator in their own right. Even then, the most well-educated and even experienced navigator could not always be trusted. For one, their education often restricted them to one particular area. Once they got out of that area, things became difficult, and some might even refuse to navigate trips to places they were unfamiliar with. The optimal navigation of a long expedition was therefore dependent both on educated men, experienced seafarers, and those familiar with the areas to be visited. It's a long list of requirements that were seldom met, and 1 in 7 ships would never return to the port they left. Navigators were often found lacking, and there is no better example than the naval disaster of 1707, when much of the English fleet and personnel, including Admiral Cloudesley Shovel, were destroyed near the Isles of Scilly owing to improper navigation. The Isles of Scilly are just a stone's throw away from the Emerald Island. As a fun side note, Cloudesley Shovel was a distant relative of multiple buccaneers and pirates, including Christopher Myngs, Sir Thomas Whetstone, and Stede Bonnet. But the disaster shouldn't really be seen as a case of occasional incompetence, but rather evidence to the difficulties of pre-modern navigation. The fact that a ship could go from one port to another was, in itself, a miracle, which makes it even more impressive how some pirates were able to complete extremely underrated deeds of navigation. William Dampier circumnavigated the world 3 times. Bartholomew Sharp was the first Englishman to steer a ship around Cape Horn from the west, an extremely difficult and stormy position. John Davis's Bachelor's Delight is said to be the first ship to ever have seen Antarctica. Pirates were often incompetent sailors and navigators, but so were many merchants and navymen, and the tales of pirate exceptionalism should not be forgotten. For this reason, masters were as important aboard pirate ships as they were on any other. But the master was more often than not a prominent officer right next to him, often commanding as much authority, perhaps even challenging him. On paper, the pirate quartermaster was supposed to be the captain's counterbalance and second in command. But owing to his merit and importance, that position was often claimed effectively by the master. Some pirate masters would ascend to captaincy themselves. Most prominent would be Richard Taylor, who'd gone to capture one of history's greatest prizes, the Nossa Senhora do Cabo. Owing to their frequent incompetence, skillful navigators were often rare, obliging pirates to abduct them as soon as they were encountered. On some pirates, the master was an officer. On others, a prisoner, a slave in anything but name. Sometimes something, strangely in between. A slave trader named William Snelgrave was kidnapped by the pirate Jeremiah Coughlin in 1719. Aboard the pirate he encountered one of his old schoolmates, James Griffin, a tall man with a broadsword and 4 pistols in his belt. Despite his fearsome appearance, Griffin had been kidnapped just like Snelgrave, forced against his will to serve as the pirate master, owing to his education and skills in navigation. Griffin could chart a course, write a log, navigate, and even bark orders. He would fight alongside the pirates, and do all of this with the knowledge that if he tried doing anything stupid, he would lose his life. And using this position, he was able to protect his old classmate. A similar fate would often befall pilots. I mentioned before how navigators were often trained regionally, and expert only in that vicinity. Ships were therefore dependent on navigators knowledgeable of a visited area. These were called pilots, and were often brought aboard a ship when entering a new area, such as a port. They would then guide a ship into safety, helping them avoid potential hazards like reefs and shallows. The pilot was afterwards paid and let go. Some pirates retired as pilots, Olivier Levasseur most notably, who piloted ships around eastern Madagascar. But he didn't exactly have a good track record, having been shipwrecked 4 times in his long career as a pirate. Of course, pilots did make mistakes and accidents were still common with them. For pirates, acquiring pilots was paramount. They would often target small ships and especially fishing vessels, taking the men aboard and forcing them to guide them around the area, avoiding enemy fortifications, geographical dangers, and leading them to wealthy targets or places to provision. Helpful pilots might be rewarded and released. Should you displease the pirates, a more horrid fate might await you. When a Spanish corsair named Blas Miguel raided the filibuster haven of Petit Goave, he kidnapped a Frenchman named Saint Antoine, resident of nearby Léogane, who was just out sailing in his canoe. Saint Antoine led the corsairs into the Petit Goave harbor. Miguel wanted to attack at night, but Saint Antoine convinced him not to, since the corsairs might shoot each other in the dark. It was a trick, and Miguel fell for it. When dawn rose, the corsairs set into action. Approaching the local fort, the commander called out to them. Saint Antoine replied, providing his name. When the commander called out again, Saint Antoine found his heart, warning the commander, "To arms!" Blas Miguel had him promptly executed. Piracy remained a mortal profession. To finish up, we can take a look at the various tools and instruments found in the navigator's cabin, utilized in easing his difficult task. Most complicated navigational tools were based on the astrolabe, first invented by Arabian astronomers around the year 700. Some of the oldest ones remaining are beautiful works of art made by Persian astronomers in the 16th and 17th centuries. A pirate undoubtedly dreamt of acquiring one of those. Anyway, it is a brass ring marked with degrees, and by looking through it and moving the sections, you can determine the angle of the sun or North Star. It was a very accurate instrument, but difficult to use reliably. The navigator needed a steady hand, his reading possibly influenced by the wind, and if his reading was even slightly off, the ship was far off the desired course. It was best used by 3 people, one to hold the instrument, another to sight the sun and adjust the arm, and a third to read a scale. The latitude and time of day could then be determined. The cross-staff or forestaff consisted of 4 square rods, 36 inches long, with 4 cross pieces made to slide upon it at right angles. These were of different lengths and were known as the 10, 30, 60, and 90 cross, and were used singly upon the staff according to the height of the sun or star. By sliding the crosspiece up or down and sighting from the end of the staff until the sun was seen at one end of the cross, the horizon at the other, the figure at the junction of the cross and staff on the side to which that particular cross belonged indicated the altitude of the sun or star. From there, the latitude was obtained. You might guess what the problem with the astrolabe and crossstaff was. They required the viewer to stare directly into the sun, which, you know, is kinda bad. Therefore, John Davies invented the iconic quadrant in 1586. It was often called the backstaff to distinguish it from the forestaff, which continued to be used into the 17th century. The quadrant looks like a long V, with an arced bar having degrees marked on it. A smaller V branch is attached in the base and on the opposite side of the long one. It also has an arced bar with marked angles. Both of the arcs had vanes. The navigator peered through the sighting vane on the big V, while positioning the vane on the smaller one called the shadow vane. At the base of the quadrant was a square with a central slit, called the horizon vane. The navigator turned away from the sun and aligned the sighting vane, so that he could see the horizon vane. He then moved the peg on the shadow vane until a shadow fell directly on the slit of the horizon vane, and these two angles told him the angle of the star and the latitude of the ship. These tools were made with exceptional craftsmanship. Carved from expensive woods like ebony or rosewood. Surviving examples are never warped or twisted, with the jointings described as intricate puzzles. In the mid-18th century, the quadrant was replaced by the octant, and finally, the sextant. The most iconic of navigational tools is, without a doubt, the compass. It is a device used to determine the direction of the North Pole by finding its magnetic pull. The first ones were just magnetized needles that pointed north while suspended from a string. By the 1500s, the needle had been mounted on a pivot and fixed with a round card containing the cardinal directions. It was mounted in a thin bowl of turned wood, and a massive one kept on the ship in a protected compartment, called the binnacle or bidicle, placed in front of the ship's helm, the steering device. The nocturnal was used at night to determine the exact hour based on the position of a star in the night sky relative to the North Star. By adjusting the movable discs to the date on the scale for the day of the month, sighting the North Star through the hole in the center, and then bringing up the arm against the guard stars, the hour was indicated with reasonable accuracy. We talked before about the line and log. Various attempts were made to supersede them. In 1578, Humphrey Cole invented a patent log with revolving blades. It never caught wind, or stream I guess, and didn't become improved and commonly used until 3 centuries later. Sounding was another crucial part of navigation. This meant that you measured the depth of a body of water to avoid getting stuck on something nasty. For this purpose, you used a line with a piece of lead, called the sounding lead. For shallow waters, you utilized a hand lead, weighing 6 pounds, connected to a 20-fathom line, that is about 36 meters. For deeper waters, a lead weighing up to 80 pounds was used, with a much longer line. The lines were marked at every fathom with bits of leather and colored rags. The base of the lead had a hollow space filled with tallow, which, when it struck the bottom, picked up sand, gravel, small stones, thus indicating what the bottom consisted of, an important feature in following charts and sailing directions into harbors and over shoals. Heaving the lead did require a lot of skill. You had to cast it in a motion conforming to the progress of the vessel, to make the line plumb with the observer and have the lead strike bottom as he took depth. A skilled navigator would also have a library of books and documents ready at his disposal. He would have instruction manuals relating to his craft, ranging from mathematics, navigation, to astronomy and astrology. Journals of sailors and travelers granted insights into how you could reach certain locations. The next best thing to actually having them aboard to pilot your ship. Some of these books were written by pirates themselves, as some of them were extraordinary navigators. Most prominent would be William Dampier, a buccaneer who circumnavigated the world 3 times and published several books. Most important to this video are A New Voyage Around the World and A Discourse of Winds. The latter covers the various prominent winds of the New World, and how to navigate using them. Dampier's expertise eventually resulted in him being employed as navigator for Woodes Rogers, a privateer captain in the War of Spanish Succession. His contributions to the sciences must not be understated. Pirates and navigators are heavily associated with colorful maps. The sort used by common mariners were more rudimentary and cheap, seldom being more than a few lines scribbled on a piece of paper, and not relied upon as much as experience and the previous methods. Specifically, mariners relied on charts, which are maps that focus on hydrographical features, and include information on sea levels, navigational hazards, winds, streams, anything and everything relevant. So, how did you acquire all of these books, instruments, and charts? You bought them, and they were all very expensive. Pirates, of course, had the benefit of stealing them, and that was often their primary method of acquisition. Sometimes it could save their lives. When Bartholomew Sharp and his company robbed the Santo Rosario, they mistook the shipment of silver for tin, but did acquire a Spanish wagoner, a book of charts, maps, and navigational instructions. This one related to the Spanish Pacific, a region largely unexplored by the English. By selling it to King Charles II, the pirates were able to get royal pardons, securing their necks the noose. Several of them would go on to publish their own journals, again containing navigational instructions and stories to inspire future merchants and pirates to sail and navigate the Pacific Ocean. This deep dive into pirate navigation is only the first part of a series that will cover other facets of pirate sailing, including steering and maneuvering, handling the winds and sails, surviving storms, and what happened if you didn't. Please let me know by liking the video, telling me in the comments, and subscribing and clicking the notification bell to get notified of their release. Until they come out, I can recommend this episode covering how the captain, master, and crew planned pirate expeditions, and how they gathered intelligence. Gold Gunpowder is produced by me alone, without the use of any artificial intelligence. And the best way of keeping me afloat is by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. This way, you can also watch the videos without ads. Enjoy!